Imagine if literally everything you've ever been taught about getting sick was just a lie. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're taking a completely objective, structured deep dive into a highly controversial and complex piece of literature. We're going to map out the architecture of a grand conspiracy theory, breaking down its scientific, historical, and sociological claims to understand exactly how the author constructs his worldview. So, the source material we're unpacking today is Marcus Heinrich Rehbach's book, The Virus Deception, Rule by Medical Myth. In this explainer, we're basically acting as your tour guides through the author's very specific architecture of belief. We aren't here to endorse or debate the claims, but rather to unpack the material and show you exactly how he built his argument, starting all the way down at the microscopic level of cellular biology up to a grand millennia-spanning historical narrative. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our clinical roadmap for today. 1. The virus deception. 2. Exosomes versus viruses. 3. The PCR test critique. 4. Medical appropriation. And finally, 5. The Nakash conspiracy. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the virus deception, framing the official narrative. Right out of the gate, the foundation of Rehbach's entire book is a total, fundamental rejection of modern virology. He actually calls it an official narrative constructed just to maintain control. His premise is totally uncompromising. He states, the real conspiracy this book exposed is that a small group of people, a medical mafia, have conspired to create and maintain a myth. Viruses are purely mythical creatures. According to the text, viruses do not exist in the real world. They're just a theoretical idea, a myth created to serve as a blank check for what he calls a medical dictatorship. Moving right along to Section 2, exosomes versus viruses, a cellular redefinition. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is, if viruses aren't real, how does the author explain the biological particles we actually see under microscopes? Well, in the official virology narrative, viruses are exogenous, meaning they come from outside the body to attack healthy cells and replicate. But Rehbach argues the exact opposite. He claims these particles are actually endogenous, created internally by our own cells. He refers to them as exosomes, which he describes as natural byproducts of our immune system, basically generated to clean up cellular damage caused by environmental shocks, toxins, or stress. To try and ground his exosome theory, the author points to real scientific literature, specifically referencing geneticist Barbara McClintock's 1983 Nobel Prize-winning work. The text uses her research on how environmental shocks can naturally alter cellular DNA to argue that the tiny fragments of DNA virologists claim are viral invaders are in reality just the body's natural trauma responses. He's basically arguing that virologists are just looking at the debris of our own immune system and completely mislabeling it as an invading pathogen. Which brings us to Section 3, the PCR test critique, breaking down the diagnostics. Having redefined the biological particles themselves, the author then transitions his attack to the primary diagnostic tool used in modern medicine, the PCR test. According to the text, the PCR test is structurally flawed and totally unfit for diagnostic purposes. He methodically lists out several alleged mechanical failures. First, he claims the PCR process just amplifies inert or dead matter that cannot self-replicate or infect anyone. Second, he argues that running these tests at high cycle thresholds, anything over 30 or 35 cycles, yields completely meaningless results. Third, he asserts that because a true virus has never actually been isolated, PCR tests are calibrated using computer-generated artificial Frankenstein DNA. And finally, he posits that the tests can be pre-configured, kind of like rigged scratch-off lottery tickets, to artificially generate false positives or negatives just to drive public fear. To bolster this massive critique, the text leans heavily on a quote from Kari Mullis, the actual Nobel Prize-winning inventor of the PCR process itself. The author uses Mullis's own words that PCR doesn't tell you that you're sick to argue that the medical establishment has deliberately misused this technology to construct the illusion of widespread viral infections. Next up is Section 4, Medical Appropriation, the Illusion of a Pandemic. So this brings us to a fascinating question. If viruses aren't real and the tests are totally invalid, how does the text explain the reality of widespread illness and death that the public actually experiences? The answer is a concept the author coined himself, medical appropriation. According to the text, the medical establishment steals the symptoms and deaths from already existing conventional conditions, things like seasonal flu, lifestyle illnesses, or chronic diseases, and falsely rebrands them as symptoms of their new imaginary virus. Let's move to and see how this builds into what the author calls the virus playbook. It's a 4-step process. Step 1, authorities find a random harmless DNA fragment. Step 2, they manufacture a PCR test to massively amplify it, creating millions of false positive cases. Step 3, the medical appropriation. They bundle the symptoms of everyday illnesses and attribute them to this fragment. And finally, step 4, they use the resulting panic and inflated case numbers to dictate unprecedented public health measures, lockdowns, and economic controls. And that leads us to Section 5, the Nash-Kosh conspiracy, the grand motive. Up to this point, we've explored the microscopic and the mechanical claims. But to understand the why behind this massive alleged playbook, we have to zoom all the way out. The text introduces a highly charged antagonist, the Nakash. The author defines Nakash as an ancient symbol of a serpent coiled around a pole. He claims this symbol represents a 3,000-year-old conspiracy orchestrated by what he terms the cult of Judah. According to the source material, this hidden elite maintains absolute control over 2 main pillars of modern society: global finance, which he links directly to the dollar sign, and the global medical profession, linking it to the caduceus or the rod of Asclepius, used by organizations like the WHO. It's right here that the author weaves his alternative cellular biology into a grand socio-historical conspiracy. He reminds the reader that the entire medical dictate, the PCR tests, the virus myth, the lockdowns, is really merely a secular weapon. It's supposedly a modern tool utilized by this ancient cult to achieve global enslavement, centralized power, and establish a new world order by driving nations into debt slavery through economic wrecking. The author literally connects the medical and financial worlds into a single apocalyptic vision, writing, "Welcome to the New World Order. 3,000 years in the planning. The serpent coiled around the pole, the dollar symbol, universally recognized and associated with finance and medicine, the 2 halves of the pincers now closing tight upon us." To try and validate this immense claim, the author constructs a massive historical timeline, seamlessly weaving ancient religious history with modern virology and current events. His timeline starts 3,000 years ago when Moses supposedly erected the Nakash symbol in the desert. Then, he jumps to the 1950s, where he claims virologists basically faked a consensus to invent infectious viruses. In 1993, the PCR test gets legitimized by a Nobel Prize, setting the stage for diagnostic manipulation. And finally, this all culminates in 2020, which the author describes as a Mockster-Greifung, a total power grab orchestrated under the guise of a pandemic. Finally, Section 6, Conclusion, the mechanics of belief. As we bring this explainer to a close, observing this material really gives us profound insight into the mechanics of belief. And this brilliantly illustrates the true anatomy of a conspiracy theory. We've seen how the author starts with a hyper-specific critique of a microscopic particle, uses genuine scientific quotes completely out of their conventional context, builds a mechanical theory of diagnostic fraud, and then seamlessly glues it all onto a 3,000-year-old religious and financial antagonist. Whether you're observing this from a scientific, sociological, or psychological perspective, the source material forces us to ask, how does the human mind synthesize complex modern medical anxiety into a millennia-old grand historical narrative? It's a profound question about the power of narrative framing in the modern world, and for sure, one that leaves us with plenty to chew on long after we wrap up today.